I think I think people struggle to make sense of dangerous things at the moment. I mean, you mentioned 9/11. That's a very good example of this, because in a different era, an attack like that might have been understood in a political way, as, you know, a specific threat, a threat that needed to be dealt with from a group of people who needed to be dealt with. It would have been viewed primarily in that fashion. But what happened with 9/11 in the current era, when it happened, is that it unleashed or intensified all the backward, reactionary, deranged trends that had already been gathering pace. I mean, the very clear example of that is conspiracy theories, which very swiftly took over from rational discussion in some quarters, and we were suddenly led to believe that George Bush did this, not Al-Qaeda. Israel was probably involved, and all these other theories that floated around in the absence of a framework through which to make sense of these kinds of events. And the absence of a framework at work, or the absence of a shared common outlook or a common language, is often the I think is the starting point of the derangement of the current moment, and particularly in the aftermath of something like 9/11. And of course, there was also a lot of the politics of fear. There was a panic. There was authoritarianism. There were various illiberal laws, not only in the US, but in the United Kingdom too, in terms of spying on people, restricting what you're allowed to say, and so on and so forth. So I find it very interesting the way in which world events or problematic events or threats to our societies, the thing we seem to struggle with is finding a common way to understand them and talk about them. And instead it fractures very quickly. And you have these competing claims as to what is the real origin of this event, what is the real meaning of it, what's the real impact of it. I think with COVID, what I find quite striking about the COVID situation is that I think it was less the threat from COVID that intensified the derangement and more the lockdown. Because what the lockdown, we had a lockdown in the United Kingdom. It was supposed to be for 3 weeks. It ended up being closer to 4 months. Of course, there were lockdowns in Europe. There were various forms of locking down in different American states. And what the lockdown did, it intensified the atomization of people. In the United Kingdom context, it completely broke up the public. There was no longer any existing public. Instead, we were all scared individuals at home whose only duty was to wait for the daily government announcement on how bad this disease was, how many people had died, and we were just all watching the death tolls and listening to the horror stories. No connection with others, no democratic sphere. Parliament was suspended. The right to protest was outlawed. There was no way in which people could come together to discuss things or talk about things. And I think in that moment, when the public was completely broken up and any sense of collectivity was completely undermined, we saw the intensification of particularly that very atomized, individuated culture of identity, of a sense of victimhood, of people just conceiving of themselves as a broken down identity, one identity group versus another identity group. Those were the things that intensified most during the lockdown period. And I think it's fascinating that the lockdown only really ended in the UK anyway, with the Black Lives Matter protests, which was really an explosion of identitarian politics, an explosion of what I would consider to be regressive politics, a very destructive, illiberal, censorious moment. Statues were torn down, statues were defaced, comedy shows were banned, people were forced to take the knee, and if they didn't, they were humiliated in public, ritually humiliated for days on end. So it was striking to me that lockdown only came to an end with this incredibly physical manifestation of the identitarian regressive politics. And I think that really demonstrated, to me anyway, that the thing that intensified during the lockdown moment was primarily the cult of identity, which I think is going to get worse and worse.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the atomization of our collective sense being broken apart physically from each other resulted in an obsessive focus on identity, because the things that tend to blur that line are connections to other people whose identity may be related but isn't the same. So I see a lot in that. On the other hand, there's certainly something to be said for the fact that people have, over time, innovated new modes. And, as much as Zoom is lacking, for example, in some of the face-to-face sense, people have defaulted to it. And so I see simultaneously people being atomized and also people coming together in ways that they were reluctant to before. Now, it may be that because there's no meaning of physical proximity anymore, due to the fact that we are, even if we're down the street from somebody, we may still do a conference call with them, that may it may allow us to choose too much who it is that we're interacting with, so that we may, or at least some of us may, default into finding people whose identity is very similar, and therefore creating identitarian echo chambers.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And it's like, social media and these other technological breakthroughs are a double-edged sword in a way, in the sense that they allow us to communicate in ways that our ancestors could only have dreamt of. I mean, it makes the printing revolution of the 15 and 1600s look like a minor affair. The fact that pretty much anyone on earth who has a mobile phone can publish his or her views instantaneously, with no need for an editor, no need for a priest, no need for a politician to tell them what they may or may not say. Although the social media oligarchs are now taking over that role increasingly, and are now saying there are certain things you can't say publicly. But that's an incredibly radical moment. The internet revolution was an incredibly radical moment, unprecedented in human history, and that's all to the good. But what's happened, I think, with technology in particular, is that it has molded itself around cultural trends that were pre-existing. And so I'm always reluctant to engage in technological determinism. I don't think technology makes us the way we are. In some instances, in some historical moments, that may well be the case. But I think most of the time, technology, we kind of get the technology we deserve as a society. So, in earlier periods, the technology was, ships that were capable of traversing entire oceans, because that moment was one of exploration and daring and the expansion of human knowledge. Or the technology might be splitting the atom and nuclear power, or the space race and various other things, which tended to reflect a sense of aspiration, a sense of ambition, a sense of desire amongst sections of humanity. What we increasingly have today is technology that allows us to live in our bubbles, which allows us to navel gaze, to self-reflect, to express our identitarian impulses in a public way, and to, as you say, create echo chambers and reinforce our existing views and protect ourselves in many ways from ever being confronted with opposing views. Technology is now very good at protecting the individual from exposure to contrasting viewpoints, contrasting political ideas, and so on. So the great irony, I think, in modern technology, particularly online, is that it creates the lonely crowd phenomenon. We're all, there was a lot of talk about the internet reconstituting the public and possibly even constituting a global public, but we all engage with it very much as atomized individuals, expressing our own identitarian ideas or our own sense of self into the void, essentially. And I think what technology has done, it's shaped itself around the kind of regressive trends that had been taking hold for the past few decades. And I think one of the striking things about the COVID period is there was a lot of connection. People did try to make connections during the lockdown. In the UK, for example, there were lots of local groups who were doing shopping for people and looking after the elderly. There was one where I live, and I was involved in that. And people really did want to have a sense of taking some collective responsibility for their fellow citizens. But the speed with which that got pushed aside by all the old rubbish I thought was so striking. So very quickly, the pandemic was racialized, for example. We were told it has a disproportionate impact on Black people and South Asian people, which may be true for various reasons, but it was the intensity of the racialization and the way it was folded into the victim narrative I thought was very striking. Of course, we've seen the rise of censorship. There are now certain things you're not allowed to say about COVID on YouTube or on Twitter and other platforms. And as I say, the explosion of identity politics, which I think really reached its crescendo after the murder of George Floyd. So that's what I found depressing about COVID and very interesting about the moment we live in. There was a collective impulse. There were people saying we have to pull together, but they were conquered by the continuing assertion of the regressive trends of our time. And I find that quite worrying.